Rediscover God's Word, verse by verse, chapter by chapter. This is Real Bible Study with teacher Tom Bradford. Welcome to Torah Class.
Well, the oracles that we find in the biblical prophets of warning and doom for the Gentile nations because of their bad treatment of Israel are at the same time messages of hope and comfort for Israel. And too much we tend to look at the government leaders of modern Israel and many of their dubious political decisions that they make and think that this must be the criteria for how God will ultimately deal with Israel. Yet we must understand that Israel is it's very different from all other nations that have ever existed, in that it is the only nation created and set apart for himself, for God. God assures us that Israel will survive and is not only at the center of his will, but also will be at the center of the government that he establishes after all that must happen has happened. Israel's good destiny will happen, not because Israel's good, but because God is good. Historically, Israel has repeatedly failed at the task to be a kingdom of light. But God will not fail to bring about his intentions. And those intentions focus on Israel's golden destiny. However, the destiny of the Gentile nations is to suffer God's direct wrath, and thus their destruction is assured, to the point that it will be as though they never existed. In the book of Obadiah, Edom is representative of both itself and on a larger scale is representative of all Gentile nations. And it's specifically called out for collaborating with Babylon in order to eliminate Judah. For Bible students, one of the most important takeaways you can have from Obadiah is that direct connection. Walk away from here understanding there is this direct connection between Edom and Babylon, especially as concerns the end times. Edom and Babylon are virtually synonymous in what they represent: unrighteousness, wickedness, anti-Israel, and therefore anti-God. These are the kingdoms of the Antichrist. Therefore, their destiny is annihilation. We were in verse 16 when we ended the previous lesson. So to get our bearings for today's study, let's reread the final 6 verses of Obadiah. Open your Bibles up to Obadiah, verse 16. For just as you have drunk on my holy mountain, so will all the nations drink in turn. Yes, they will drink and gulp it down and be as if they had never existed. But on Mount Zion, there will be a holy remnant who will escape. And the house of Yaakov, the house of Jacob, will repossess their rightful inheritance. The house of Jacob will be a fire, the house of Joseph a flame, setting aflame and consuming the stubble, which is the house of Esau. None of the house of Esau will remain, for Adonai has spoken. Those in the Negev will repossess the mountain of Esau. Those in the Shephelah, the land of the Philistines. So they will repossess the field of Ephraim and the field of Samaria, and Benjamin will occupy Gilead. Those from his army of the people of Israel, exiled among the Canaanites as far away as Zarephath, and the exiles from Jerusalem and Sepharad will repossess the cities in the Negev. Then the victorious will ascend Mount Zion to rule over Mount Esau, but the kingship will belong to Adonai. Verse 16 says, the nations will suffer all the calamities that Israel has suffered. But verse 17 says, Israel will experience the opposite. This optimism needs to be tempered, however, because it also says only a holy remnant will escape. In other words, it's not as though in the final battle that Israel will somehow escape unscathed. In fact, it appears that all that will remain of it will be a remnant. It's interesting that Joel speaks of the same event, but with a different perspective. In Joel 4, verses 14 through 17, we read, such enormous crowds in the valley of decision, for the day of Adonai is upon us in the valley of decision. The sun and the moon have grown black, the stars have stopped shining. Adonai will roar from Zion, he will thunder from Jerusalem, the sky and the earth will shake. But Adonai will be a refuge for his people, a stronghold for the people of Israel. You will know that I am Adonai, your God, living on Zion, my holy mountain. Then Jerusalem will be holy, and foreigners will pass through her no more. Now notice that this Joel passage tells us of the same event as in Obadiah, verse 17, and how the emphasis is on a newly restored holiness of Jerusalem. So the question is, so when did Jerusalem lose its holy status? What is it that will return Jerusalem to its holy standing? Answer, what it's always been. Jehovah's presence in his holy temple. So clearly a temple must be standing at that moment. What Obadiah sees is God's remedy for past events of Jerusalem's desecration. And although I could cite several examples, I'm just going to give you two so you can see what I'm getting at. In Jeremiah 51:51, the reproaches we have heard have put us to shame. Disgrace covers our faces because foreigners have entered the sanctuaries of Adonai's house. Psalm 79:1, a psalm of Asaph. God, the pagans have entered your heritage. They have defiled your holy temple. They turned Jerusalem into rubble. Now, although the temple was rebuilt upon Judah's return from Babylon, the reality is that the Ark of the Covenant wasn't in the Holy of Holies. It had gone missing. Therefore, since the Ark of the Covenant is tied to God's presence, then without the presence of the Ark, no holiness was possible. So the idea of designating Jerusalem as holy during those 500 years after the Jews returned from Babylon until its destruction, this time at the hands of the Romans, is also not actually possible. When the high priest would enter the Holy of Holies for but once per year on Yom Kippur, after Babylon, he entered into an empty room. So when the high priest sprinkled the blood of atonement, it was not onto the holy ark as prescribed, it was onto the floor, thus probably having no effect. Now, because it's so important for us to grasp, I'm going to say this another way. Jerusalem has suffered from being not holy since the time Babylon destroyed the temple right until today. So what Joel and Obadiah prophesy is that in the end times, God will make his presence again in a new temple As a result, finally, after all this time, Jerusalem will again be holy. This nearly for sure means the reappearance, somehow, of the Ark of the Covenant. And rabbis have been looking for centuries to the whereabouts of the Ark. The enormity of such an event it's staggering, in effect. Staggering. And that is why the prophets speak of it as they do. Now, verse 18, still it's God, speaking to Judah, connects three important names from Israel's past in Jacob, Joseph, and Esau. Now, Jacob and Joseph, of course, are mentioned as representative of the covenant people. Esau represents those who are outside the covenant. Also notice that Jacob and Joseph symbolize fire and flame. Esau symbolizes the stubble that the fire and flame consume. Now, because the names Jacob and Israel are synonymous, then the way the name Jacob is typically used in the Bible is to represent all the tribes of Israel. But the mention of Joseph is only to the two sons that he sired, two sons who gained tribal status, Ephraim and Manasseh. Ephraim and Manasseh went on to become the largest tribes along with Judah. But more, those two tribes, along with 8 others, broke away from Israel proper to become their own separate kingdom that the Bible calls the Northern Kingdom. This now divided house of Jacob also consisted of a southern kingdom that was called Judah. So in this passage, Jacob is used to speak of the kingdom of Judah, Joseph, the kingdom of Ephraim, Israel. And clearly the two kingdoms have come back together as one in order to deal with Edom. The fire and the flame come together as one to deal with the stubble. In fact, this plays exactly into a famous prophecy in which Ezekiel also speaks of these events of the end times and then Israel's role in it. Ezekiel 37, starting at verse 15. The word of Adonai came to me. You, human being, take one stick and write on it for Judah and those joined with him among the people of Israel. Next, take another stick and write on it for Joseph, the stick of Ephraim, and all the house of Israel who are joined with him. And finally, bring them together into a single stick so that they become one in your hand. And when your people ask you what all this means, tell them that Adonai Elohim says this: I will take the stick of Joseph, which is in the hand of Ephraim, together with the tribes of Israel who are joined with him, and put them together with the stick of Judah, and make them a single stick so that they become one in my hand. The sticks on which you are to write are to be in your hand as they watch. Then say to them that Adonai Elohim says, I'll take the people of Israel from among the nations where they have gone. I'm going to gather them from every side and bring them back to their own land. I will make them one nation in the land on the mountains of Israel. One king will be king for them, for all of them. They will no longer be two nations. They will never again be divided into two kingdoms. Now, all the prophets that came and went over the many centuries who prophesied about the end times, Israel, fate of the nations, it was remarkably consistent. And because each one offered a little different perspective, or they focused on a different aspect of end times events, we can put together the information to paint a more robust picture. But always it focuses on the restoration of Israel and on the return of holiness to Jerusalem. When we put the pieces together, we see that Israel will be decimated. Decimated. Not by God, but through tribulation that the Gentile nations thrust upon Israel. However, in repayment for doing this, God will intervene with his divine wrath and then turn around and punish the nations. We also learned that Jordan will be heavily involved. In addition, none of this happens until representatives of the northern kingdom and representatives of the southern kingdom have returned to Israel and united under one banner and one government. They have done this. They have done this. So we can check this event off the end times list. We learned that all the nations of the world turn against Israel. This is happening before our eyes as a consequence of the Israeli-Gaza war. We also learned that Israel will again control and live on the mountains of Israel. This means Judea and Samaria, which today is known as the West Bank, that is home to the Palestinians. Israel does not have full control or sovereignty over that area. So we should be watching for that to happen in the near future. And finally, Jordan, Edom, has to become weak and feckless. Well, it's well down that road. As a declining nation with poor leadership, little natural resources, poor economy, and as such, the Arab world, as well as the West, is generally ambivalent about them. It's not amounting to much. Well, back to the mention of Jacob as fire and Joseph as flame. Biblically, fire is symbolic of one of two things, or actually of two things. It's either purification or it's for destruction. Purification or destruction. In Bible think, purification and destruction are, of course, opposites. Purification is the pathway to holiness. Destruction is the fate of wickedness. Politically, Esau as the stubble and as representative of all the Gentile nations is then worthy only of destruction. And Israel, as fire and flame, will be God's instrument in bringing this about. Now, the extent of the destruction to Esau and to the nations is emphasized with the words to end verse 18 that says, none will remain, as if to imply that not one person will remain alive. Yet linguistically speaking, that's not really the case. The term none doesn't really appear in the verse. More literally, it says there will be no survivors. So, yet biblically speaking, such a notion does not equate to the English equivalent of none, meaning zero. Okay? It works the same for the Hebrew notion of the word all, kol, in Hebrew. All or none, biblically, means mostly all, mostly none. Okay? If we were to take this statement literally, it would mean that after God's wrath, not one single person living anywhere in Israel would survive. And clearly that's not the case, since prophecies speak of nations existing after the end times apocalypse. Now, verse 18 ends with the words, for Jehovah has spoken it. The point of God saying this is so that Israel and all God worshipers can be certain that it is Jehovah who says this. That is, this prophecy comes from the God whose name is Jehovah. And just as important, since it comes from God, it is 100% certain that it will happen, just as it's spoken. Yet one of the points of debate about prophecies such as Obadiah's is that it speaks only of things that happened long ago in the past, and people are wrongly inferring that it's speaking of the future. Well, listen to Jeremiah. Jeremiah 49:12. For this is what Adonai says, those who do not deserve to drink from this cup will have to drink it anyway. So why should you go unpunished? No, you will not go unpunished. You will certainly drink it. Okay. Jeremiah was an adult living in Judah when Babylon invaded and exiled the people. Yet instead of speaking in the incomplete tense about Edom and the nations, incomplete similar to the past tense in English, Jeremiah recorded God as saying that when Edom and the nations are punished, it will be a later time, not as something that's already happened. So this is just one of several proofs that these are end times events, even though they happen to a lesser extent in the ancient past. Now, in a word, restoration is the theme of verses 19 through 21. A good way to think of these verses is as Obadiah's further explanation of what the previous verses meant. That is, these are Obadiah's words, inspired certainly, but not the same level of perfection as recording what Jehovah showed him in a vision. There are 4 sets of word associations here that, once we see this, makes the structure easier to understand. First, Negev is connected with Mount Esau. Second, Shephelah is connected with Philistines. Third, the territory of Ephraim is connected to the territory of Samaria. And finally, Benjamin is connected with Gilead. At the time Obadiah wrote this, it seems that Edom occupied a good portion of the southern desert region of Judah that's called the Negev. And the Philistines occupied most of the Mediterranean coastal plain of Judah called the Shephelah. The connection between Samaria and the Ephraimites was plain because Samaria was the capital city of the territory the Ephraimites held. The connection between Benjamin and Gilead, however, is cloudy. Since the Negev was controlled by Edom, the prophecy is that this situation will reverse. The same for the Shephelah. The Philistines will eventually be booted out. Now, the territory of Ephraim essentially refers to most of the northern kingdom that was conquered by Assyria about 723 BC, and today it's what's called the West Bank, controlled by the Palestinians. The prophecy is that control of this territory will return to Israel. Gilead is on the east side of the Jordan River, an area that very early in Israel's occupation of Canaan were the territories of Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh. Benjamin was actually originally part of the northern kingdom and represented the southernmost of their border. Later, it got annexed by Judah. At any rate, the prediction is the inhabitants of that territory will move east and they will take over the territory on the east side of the Jordan that at one time belonged to Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh. Today, that territory belongs to Jordan, Edom. Thus, all these changes represent Israel's restoration in all of its parts, largely back to the way it was after Joshua first led Israel into the promised land and conquered the various peoples that were living there. It's understood that while geographical names are used, in fact, it's really referring more to the people of those regions. Well, as we move on to verse 20, the first words are the exiles. Most Bible scholars will tell us that this verse is very difficult to translate, and very likely because there are some errors in its transmission that are not uncommon among the oldest handwritten texts, because there are certain Hebrew letters that are notoriously similar looking to others, and they often got confused. There seems to be two groups of exiles that are being spoken about. And it's these two groups of exiles that will take possession of the Negev away from Edom. And due to the beginning syntax of this verse, it means that the happenings depicted in verse 20 are more or less simultaneous with those of verse 19. The exiles that are being spoken of, and I'm still assuming it's two groups of exiles, must be speaking of the exiles sent away from the northern kingdom of Ephraim, Israel by the Assyrians, later the exiles sent away from the southern kingdom of Judah by the Babylonians. This for certain is not speaking of any military, but rather simply as civilians, those people taken captive from both Judah and Ephraim, Israel. Now, the book of Ezekiel speaks of this in its own way. It's enlightening when we connect it to Obadiah. And that's what we should be doing with these prophets, connecting them. Starting with Ezekiel 37, verse 1. With the hand of Adonai upon me, Adonai carried me out by his spirit and set me down in the middle of a valley. It was full of bones. And he had me pass by all around them. There were so many bones lying in the valley. They were so dry. And he asked me, human being, can these bones live? I answered, Adonai Elohim, only you know that. And then he said to me, well, then prophesy over these bones and say to them, dry bones, hear what Adonai has to say. To these bones, Adonai Elohim says, I'll make breath enter you. You will live. I will attach ligaments to you, make flesh grow on you, cover you with skin, and put breath in you. You will live, and you will know that I am Adonai. So I prophesied as ordered, and while I was prophesying, there was a noise. There was a rattling sound. It was the bones coming together, each bone in its proper place, and as I watched, ligaments grew on them, flesh appeared on them, skin covered them, but there was no breath in them. And next he said to me, prophesy to the breath. Prophesy, human being, say to the breath that Adonai Elohim says, come from the four winds, breath. Breathe on these slain so that they can live. So I prophesied as ordered. The breath came into them, and they were alive. And they stood up on their feet, a huge army. And then he said to me, human being, these bones are the whole house of Israel. And they are saying, our bones have dried up, our hope is gone, we are completely cut off. Therefore prophesy and say to them that Adonai Elohim says, my people. I will open your graves and make you get up out of your graves, and I will bring you into the land of Israel. Then you will know that I'm Adonai, when I have opened your graves and made you get up out of your graves, my people. I will put my spirit in you, and you will be alive. Then I will place you in your own land, and you will know that I, Adonai, have spoken, that I have done it, says Adonai. So Ezekiel's prophecy speaks of the awakening Of all these Israelites scattered to the four winds for so long that they had lost any hope that they could possibly be reassembled as a people and return to their former land. Now, of course, for this to happen, the land of Israel first had to be reestablished. And one of the most amazing, miraculous fulfillments of prophecy in 1948, it happened. Now, a few decades later, those rattling bones of Ezekiel have indeed come alive, and the descendants of all 12 tribes of Israel are coming back to their homeland, drawn there by some mysterious, invisible hand that they can reclaim their inheritance. I'm sad. I'm disheartened that so few believers have even noticed that this is happening. The same believers that seem to want to know so much about end times matters are oblivious to what is happening with Israel. And if they've noticed, too much it is acknowledged with a ho-hum. And this has nothing to do with me, mindset, with many cheering on and supporting Israel's arch enemies. And yet, the end times completely revolves around Israel and God vindicating them. In church, I'm going to remind you that you did not replace national or ethnic Israel. You did not. You did not take over Israel's blessings from God, as this blasphemous doctrine that you have has become so foundational for the Constantinian church. The phrase, the land of the Canaanites, up to Zarephath, is referring to the inhabitants of the coast that's north of Mount Carmel. Those inhabitants were the Phoenicians. Why use the term Canaanites? When the Canaanites had centuries earlier than Obadiah been rooted out and taken over by Israel. Because by invoking that term, the idea is to recall all the land that was originally promised to Moses for the Israelite people that he led out of Egypt. Zarephath then was a Phoenician city. Zarephath represented the farthest northern extent of the territory that God had given to Israel. It's kind of important to know where that place is today in modern terms, since it's going to help us to understand the sorts of things that must happen, where they must happen, in order for this prophecy to be fulfilled. Well, this place is today located in what is the coast of Lebanon, next to the village of Seraphant. It is interesting that at least some of what is modern-day Lebanon is actually mentioned in the Bible as being part of Israel's land inheritance. Here's but one of a few passages that speak of this. Deuteronomy 1, 6 through 8. Adonai spoke to us in Horeb, and he said, "You have lived long enough by this mountain. Turn, get moving, and go to the hill country of the Amorites, all the places near there in the Arabah, the hill country, the Shephelah, the Negev, and by the seashore, the land of the Canaanites and the Lebanon, as far as the great river, the Euphrates River. I have set this land before you. Go in, take possession of the land Adonai swore to give to your ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and their descendants after them." The next phrase in Obadiah 20 that speaks of where the exiles will come from mentions the exiles of Jerusalem who are in Sepharad. Now, the use of the word Jerusalem doesn't mean only the city. It was just a common way of expressing all of Judah, since Jerusalem was Judah's capital. That's the easy part. The hard part is in determining the whereabouts of Sepharad. Part of the problem comes from some obvious copyist errors. For instance, in the Greek Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible that dates to the 3rd century BC, which, by the way, is the text source for the Old Testament of most modern Bibles. Instead of this verse reading Sepharad, it reads Ephratah, which is a clear misspelling, because if taken literally, it means an area near Bethlehem, and this makes no sense. Likewise, the Latin Vulgate Bible has Bosphorus, that is the strait between Asia Minor and Thrace, which equally makes no sense, and almost certainly it's just a misspelling. The two most popular views are that either Sepharad is referring to Spain, which is what the Aramaic Targum and the Peshitta interpret it as, or to Sardis, that's located in Western Asia Minor. I just don't think it's possible to be exactly certain of where this is referring to. Yet the essence of it is, wherever this is, it's far away. And so even those descendants of Judah, the Jews, that live in the most remote places will somehow be included in the restoration process. Now, the final phrase speaks of Israel repossessing the cities of the Negev. The Negev is the vast desert region of southern Israel. It would seem like an unlikely place, if you've ever been there, for any people group such as Edom to set up towns and cities. So for Israel to again possess them seems very dubious. However, pretty recent archaeological digs have uncovered a growing, if not thriving, ancient Edomite presence in the Negev. So apparently this is what this verse is talking about. Verse 21 now brings Obadiah to a close. And we find that Israel will have deliverers, plural, that lead them up to Mount Zion to judge Mount Esau. Deliverers cannot be referring to Yeshua, because clearly it is speaking of more than one. And to go up to Mount Zion, meaning the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, to judge means it more in the sense of ruling over Esau, Edom, than in some kind of a judicial trial. We find the term deliverers used in other places in the Old Testament, which can be a helpful tool to understand what it's talking about. Nehemiah can be instructional in Nehemiah 9:27. So you handed them over to the power of their adversaries who oppressed them, yet in the time of their trouble, when they cried out to you, you heard from heaven. And in keeping with your great compassion, you gave them saviors, you gave them deliverers to save them from the power of their adversaries. So it is that we are to understand the term deliverers in the context of having great heroes that arise among Israel to save them from their oppressors. That's how we need to understand the words of Obadiah 21. Now, the verse, and in a way, what it is that God has to say about Judah in Obadiah can be summed up by saying that three main points are made. And to use Douglas Stewart's words, those 3 points are these. First, Jerusalem will again be the center of refuge and prosperity for the exiles of Israel. Second, Jerusalem, as the capital of Judah, will control a subdued Edom, Jordan, in the restoration era. And third, Jehovah will be acknowledged supreme. And as Stewart wisely points out, the reason for this third point is so important. It's because the Israelites whether of the northern kingdom or the southern kingdom, they continued to understand Jehovah as but one among a large pantheon of gods. Obadiah's prophecy essentially says that someday that error that is so embedded in the minds of the Israelites, and Israel made Israel too much like the pagan world, who believe the same thing, it's going to get resolved. And they will come to see Jehovah as the only God in existence, and so will worship and appeal only to him. One more thing I'd like to point out, and then we'll close the study of Obadiah. Notice how we have the words, deliverers will go up to Mount Zion to judge Mount Esau. What this verse does is to summarize that in the end, in the final battle on earth, it will be about Mount Zion against Mount Esau. Jacob against his twin brother. Israel against Jordan and the whole world for that matter. The covenant people against the non-covenant people. And that, as impossible as it might seem to us today, even to Israel, Israel will be victorious over the entire world. Well, that concludes our study of the book of Obadiah. Okay?
For more teachings of real Bible study and to rediscover God's Word with Tom Bradford, visit Torah Class today on the web, streaming TV, or download the Torah Class mobile app.